Usually, when we look at a map of the world to try and understand international relations, we expect, a certain level of clarity.
Right, you want it to be simple.
Yeah. You see those neat color-coded countries, the solid black lines for borders, maybe the capital cities marked with little stars.
It's very orderly.
It is. It gives this illusion of a static, orderly board game, right? Where foreign policy is just this straightforward interaction between different governments.
It's definitely a comforting way to look at the world, but I mean, it implies that geography and diplomacy are these fixed, easily defined constructs.
Which they really aren't.
No, not at all. The reality of how nations interact, especially when you've got massive economic stakes involved, it rarely respects those neat black lines.
Which becomes, honestly, incredibly obvious the moment you step into the world of energy geopolitics. Suddenly, that tidy political map is essentially useless.
Yeah, you basically have to throw it out.
Exactly. You have to overlay it with what is basically a shadow map. It's this messy, pulsating network of pipelines and shipping lanes and, subterranean reservoirs.
Right, the physical infrastructure of global power.
And understanding the shadow map is exactly what we are doing in today's deep dive. So, welcome. If you're listening to this, you are the learner, and you're here to get the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed without, drowning in information overload.
Which is easy to do at this topic.
Oh, for sure. So today we are unpacking a really comprehensive analysis. It's titled, Why Does the U.S. Target Oil-Rich Nations? The Geopolitics of Energy. And our mission for this deep dive is to look past the daily breaking news alerts and examine the actual mechanical gears of global power and diplomacy.
And this document is fascinating, really, because it forces us to look strictly at those underlying mechanics.
Right.
It strips away all the usual political rhetoric that we hear on the news, and it focuses entirely on how energy reserves drive foreign policy, sanctions, and strategic interventions. It's a very pragmatic and arguably pretty ruthless framework for understanding state behavior.
And just to lay our cards on the table right at the top, this analysis offers some highly direct critiques of U.S. foreign policy and the motivations behind international conflicts.
It definitely goes there.
It does. And we are here to navigate those theories and arguments impartially. We're not taking any political sides today. We're just looking at this through the lens of political science and macroeconomics, right? We're dissecting the case studies exactly as they're presented in the text to understand the mechanical reality the authors are describing.
A reality that starts with a really fundamental premise that I think often gets lost in our current cultural conversation.
What do you mean?
Well, there is this tendency lately to talk as if we are already living in a post-oil world.
Oh, right. Because of all the talk about EVs and solar.
Exactly. We focus heavily on renewables and electric vehicles, which is great. But the text begins by firmly grounding us in the present reality. And that reality is that petroleum remains the undisputed lifeblood of the global economy.
Yeah, it's so easy to just think of oil as like the price of gas at the pump when you're filling up your car.
Right, but it's so much more than that.
It is. The analysis goes way deeper into macroeconomic dependence. It's the core energy source for global manufacturing. It fuels the massive cargo ships and the freight trains that make international logistics even possible.
Yeah.
And critically, and the text makes a big point of this, you cannot project global military power without a massive, highly reliable supply of petroleum.
Which brings us directly to the concept of energy security.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly does energy security mean in this context?
So in the context of U.S. strategic interests, energy security isn't merely about having enough domestic oil to keep American cars running.
Right.
It's really about ensuring a stable, uninterrupted flow of oil to global markets. The absolute paramount objective is preventing sudden, systemic price shocks.
Because if a massive amount of oil is suddenly taken off the market, we aren't just looking at, slightly more expensive groceries. We're talking about severe cost push inflation.
Exactly. It's the kind of inflation that acts as a cascading failure across the board.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, think about it. If the cost of moving goods skyrockets, manufacturing slows down, corporate margins collapse, and you trigger this widespread economic stagnation, the U.S. economy, despite being so massive, is incredibly vulnerable to these global supply shocks.
It makes me think of oil less as a commodity and more as like the invisible operating system of the global economy.
That's a great way to put it.
Right, like every piece of software, every supply chain, every market, they all rely on that base operating system functioning smoothly. So if a hostile actor controls a massive portion of the world's energy supply, they essentially hold the power to introduce a glitch that crashes the entire system.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the strategic anxiety that's described in the text. Maintaining that operating system is treated as a matter of supreme national security.
So it's life or death for the economy.
Pretty much. Therefore, any oil-rich nation that's governed by a regime perceived as hostile, they aren't just a political adversary. They are automatically categorized as a direct mechanical threat to global stability.
But the physical barrels of oil are really only half the equation here, right?
Right.
Because the analysis pivots into global finance at this point, and this is where the mechanics get incredibly intricate. Because the real leverage isn't just about controlling the black liquid itself, it's about the specific paper used to buy it.
Yes, we are talking about the petrodollar
The
system.
petrodollar.
Yeah, it is arguably one of the most powerful economic engines on the planet, and yet it largely operates totally in the background of public awareness. Most people don't even know it exists.
So let's bring it into the foreground for the listener. The text notes this system has been in place since the 1970s. How did the global oil trade get so inextricably locked to the U.S. dollar?
Well, following a series of geopolitical shifts, and specifically the end of the gold standard in the early 70s, an arrangement was solidified, and this largely started with Saudi Arabia. It standardized the global oil trade. The agreement was that oil exports would be priced and sold almost exclusively in U.S. dollars.
Wow. Just dollars.
Just dollars. So
Right.
if Japan wants to buy oil from a Middle Eastern producer, they cannot use Japanese yen. They have to acquire U.S. dollars first to execute that transaction.
Which creates this massive, artificial, constant global demand for U.S. currency.
Exactly.
But okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to push on this a bit. I understand that creates demand, but why doesn't Europe, for example, just mandate that they will only buy oil in euros?
Right.
Like, wouldn't that boost their own currency's power? Why is the dollar so sticky?
It's a great question, and it comes down to a concept called petrodollar recycling.
Petroleum recycling, okay.
Yeah, and the framework of this text relies heavily on understanding this. When oil-producing nations sell massive quantities of oil, they accumulate billions of surplus U.S. dollars, right? They don't just put that cash in a giant vault. They need a safe, highly liquid place to invest it so it actually generates a return. And the deepest, most liquid, safest financial market in the world is the U.S. Treasury bond market.
Wait, so they take the dollars they made selling oil to the world and they loan them right back to the United States government by buying treasuries.
Precisely. They recycle the dollars back into the U.S. financial system.
That is wild.
It's brilliant strategically. This mechanism is critical because it essentially finances U.S. deficit spending. Because the rest of the world constantly needs dollars to buy oil, and oil producers constantly reinvest those dollars into U.S. debt, the United States is able to maintain incredibly high levels of national debt.
Without crashing the value of its currency.
Exactly. Or triggering hyperinflation.
So it basically exports American inflation. The strength of the entire U.S. financial apparatus is tethered to the fact that the rest of the world has no choice but to transact in dollars just to keep their lights on.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that network effect is exactly why Europe can't easily switch to the euro for oil.
The infrastructure is just too entrenched.
Right. The clearinghouses, the bond markets, they are all completely optimized for this dollar-centric loop. Breaking out of it requires overcoming immense friction.
Which clarifies a major assertion in the text. When a major oil producer decides they want to, unplug from this matrix, say they announce they want to sell their oil in euros or Chinese yuan or gold, it is not viewed in Washington as just some simple alternative business choice.
Far from it. According to the analysis, attempting to bypass the petrodollar is interpreted as a direct existential challenge to American economic hegemony.
An existential threat.
Yeah, because if the artificial global demand for the dollar evaporates, the foundational math that allows the U.S. to carry its debt and project global power, it all begins to unravel.
So threatening the petrodollar system is basically the fastest way to put a target on your back. And this moves us from the macroeconomic theory into how this actually plays out on the geopolitical chessboard. The source provides two very distinct case studies: Venezuela and Iran.
Two very different situations.
Right. Let's start with Venezuela because the text specifically highlights the Orinoco Belt, and the sheer volume of resources there is just staggering.
It really is. Venezuela sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves.
Really. More than Saudi Arabia.
More than Saudi Arabia, more than anyone else. But here's the catch. The Orinoco Belt isn't filled with the light, easily refined crude oil that you might find elsewhere.
Okay.
It contains heavy crude and tar sands.
Which completely changes the economics of extracting it, right? Because you can't just stick a pipe in the ground and watch it gush.
Exactly. Extracting and upgrading that heavy crude requires immense capital investment. You need highly specialized refining technology and constant expensive infrastructure maintenance.
So they need outside help.
Historically, yes. Foreign corporations, often Western companies, provided that capital and expertise.
But the relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela soured dramatically when the Venezuelan government moved to nationalize those oil assets.
Nationalization is the critical catalyst here. The state essentially seized control of the resources and the infrastructure from those private foreign companies.
Right.
And from a U.S. strategic perspective, this was a massive disruption. It took the world's largest oil reserves out of the predictable, corporate-driven global market and placed them under the direct, monopolistic control of a political regime that was increasingly hostile to U.S. interests.
And crucially, by kicking out those foreign companies, they also lost access to the specialized technology and the capital required to actually process that heavy crude.
Exactly. The state-run company really struggled to maintain the output.
So the U.S. response was to apply intense economic sanctions. But if the goal of those sanctions, as the text suggests, was to pressure the administration into alignment with Western economic norms, we have to acknowledge a bit of a contradiction here.
What's that?
Well, the Venezuelan government hasn't collapsed. They are still in power. So did the sanctions fail?
It really depends on how you measure failure. If the goal was immediate regime change, you could definitely argue they fell short.
Sure.
But if the goal was economic containment, preventing a hostile actor from utilizing the world's largest oil reserves to fund regional opposition to the U.S., well, the sanctions achieved a severe crippling of their extraction capabilities.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's a strategy of using economic leverage to dictate resource management, even if the political outcome is just a protracted stalemate.
Okay, now, contrast that Venezuelan strategy with the second case study the text provides, Iran. Because if Venezuela is a story about raw volume and heavy crude, Iran is a story about geographic leverage.
Specifically, the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
Iran's geographic position makes it one of the most critical players in global energy logistics. The strait is this incredibly narrow waterway through which a massive percentage of the entire world's daily oil supply must pass.
So it's a massive transit choke point.
It is the ultimate global transit choke point.
But, so wait, Venezuela controls the actual oil in the ground, but Iran controls the hallway that everyone else's oil has to travel through to reach the open ocean.
Exactly. Which gives Iran the theoretical capability to disrupt global supply chains at will. If they were to blockade or even severely threaten shipping in that waterway, the energy security we discussed earlier, the prevention of global price shocks, would instantly collapse.
So U.S. policy there isn't just about Iran's own oil exports.
No, not at all.
The text frames it as an overriding strategic imperative to ensure that Iran cannot use its geographic position as a tool of regional coercion.
Coupled with nuclear non-proliferation efforts, yes.
Yeah.
The U.S. objective is to prevent a scenario where a major energy producer can essentially hold the global economy hostage by threatening that specific choke point.
So what does this all mean? This brings us to a glaring tension that the analysis spends a lot of time unpacking. When we watch the news or listen to diplomatic press conferences, the public messaging about why the U.S. sanctions a country like Venezuela or Iran is almost entirely framed around, human rights abuses, authoritarianism, promoting democracy.
Right.
But this document seems to suggest a much more calculated, mechanical reality behind those interventions.
It does. The authors of the text highlight a profound disconnect between the public rhetoric of democratic values and the reality of strategic action. They point out a very stark pattern of selectivity.
Okay, let's look at that selectivity impartially, strictly based on what's in the text. The argument is that while human rights are cited to justify intervention, nations with similarly poor human rights records or authoritarian regimes that maintain friendly energy policies face significantly less scrutiny from Washington.
Exactly. And the defining characteristic of a friendly energy policy in this context is participating cooperatively in the petrodollar system and ensuring stable market flows. Yeah, the text is uncompromising on this observation. If your energy policy aligns with U.S. economic interests and helps recycle petrodollars, your internal politics are largely tolerated.
But if your energy policy threatens global stability or you attempt to bypass the dollar, or you disrupt a choke point, suddenly your internal politics become grounds for severe diplomatic and economic intervention.
Which leads us to the actual mechanism of that intervention. We aren't primarily talking about military invasions in this era. We are talking about financial warfare. The weapon of choice is the economic sanction.
But how does a sanction actually work mechanically? I think a lot of people assume it just means the U.S. stops buying oil from that country.
Right, which isn't the whole picture.
Especially since the U.S. doesn't even buy much oil from Iran anyway. So how does Washington stop a country in Asia or Europe from buying Iranian oil?
That is where the architecture of the global financial system comes into play, specifically tools like the SWIFT network and secondary sanctions.
Okay, what is SWIFT?
SWIFT is the secure messaging system that banks use to transmit information and instructions across borders. And the U.S. exerts massive influence over this network.
So if you cut a country's central bank out of SWIFT, they literally cannot process international digital payments.
Exactly. They are digitally isolated. And then secondary sanctions take it a step further.
How so?
The U.S. effectively tells every foreign bank and corporation in the world, you can do business with the sanctioned country, or you can do business with the United States financial system. You cannot do both.
Oh, wow. That is a heavy ultimatum.
It is. Because the U.S. market is so massive, and because international trade requires U.S. dollars, almost every global bank complies. If, say, a French bank processes an Iranian oil transaction, the U.S. will cut that French bank off from the American financial system.
It's the ultimate trump card.
Truly.
The source breaks down the specific goals of utilizing this kind of financial warfare, and it acts very much like a modern siege tactic.
What's fascinating here is how directly it mirrors a medieval siege.
Right. In a medieval siege, you surround a castle and cut off the food supply to force a surrender. Today, you surround a nation with secondary sanctions and cut off their oil revenue.
And the effects are highly calculated. The text outlines 4 main goals. The first primary objective is to force diplomatic concessions. You squeeze the target's economy so severely that the regime realizes the only way to survive is to come to the negotiating table on U.S. terms.
Right. And another goal highlighted in the text is limiting military funding.
Right.
Because a sanctioned country cannot easily modernize its military, they can't purchase advanced defense systems or fund proxy groups in the region if they can't sell their primary export to generate capital. The sanction acts as a preemptive strike on their defense budget without firing a single shot.
Then there is the domestic angle, the third goal. By effectively embargoing their exports, you trigger massive inflation, unemployment, and scarcity within the target nation's domestic economy.
To make the citizens angry.
Exactly. The underlying theory is that the citizens will become so impoverished and frustrated by the lack of basic goods that they will exert intense political pressure or even revolt against the government that the U.S. opposes.
It's a brutal mechanism when you look at it clearly. And the fourth and final objective ties all of this back to our earlier discussion about currency. These sanctions protect and reinforce the dominance of the U.S. dollar.
They absolutely do.
By isolating a target nation from the global financial system, it sends a clear, chilling message to the rest of the world. Doing business outside the dollar matrix results in economic exile.
It proves that the petrodollar system isn't just an economic convenience. It is a vital pillar of national security. The targeting of oil-rich nations is this incredibly integrated strategy.
It's all connected.
Right. It involves maintaining financial hegemony through the dollar, ensuring physical security by controlling logistical choke points, and guaranteeing macroeconomic stability by managing the flow of heavy crude and light sweet crude alike.
Currency, geography, and petroleum are just completely inseparable in this framework. And honestly, understanding this intricate web changes how you consume information entirely.
It really does.
Why should you, the listener, care about all this? Because every headline about a new wave of secondary sanctions or a tense diplomatic summit over a waterway or a sudden currency fluctuation, it isn't just a distant political squabble.
No, you start to see the gears turning underneath it all. You recognize that those geopolitical chess moves are directly tied to the stability of the global markets, the inflation rate affecting your local economy, and the overarching architecture of global trade.
You're seeing the code of the operating system.
Yeah.
But, the analysis leaves us with a really fascinating concluding thought.
Oh, about the energy transition.
Yeah. It notes that as the global energy transition progresses, these dynamics may shift. While petroleum is the absolute center of gravity today, that transition toward alternative energy is undeniably happening.
It is a slow transition, but it presents a massive strategic puzzle for the future. I mean, for the last half century, the control and pricing of oil have been the absolute bedrock of American strategic leverage.
Right, so consider this as we wrap up today. If the world truly manages to transition away from oil in the coming decades, if renewables and electric grids become the dominant infrastructure, the foundation of the petrodollar system starts to crack.
It has to.
Right. That artificial mandatory global demand for the US dollar to buy energy begins to evaporate. The leverage of the modern financial siege weakens. So what happens to the global power dynamic then?
It requires completely redrawing that geopolitical shadow map we discussed at the beginning of the episode.
Exactly.
If the age of oil wanes, the scramble for dominance doesn't end. It just changes focus.
What is the next critical resource that drives global hegemony? Will the covert interventions, the diplomatic standoffs, and the crippling economic sanctions of the late 21st century be fought over the lithium, the cobalt, and the rare earth minerals sitting inside your electric car battery?
It's a very real possibility.
As the world stops fighting over the oil under the sand, it seems likely the new shadow map will just chart a different set of subterranean resources. It leaves you wondering what the geopolitics of a truly post-oil world will look like, and who will hold the leverage when the global operating system gets its next major hardware update.